Welcome to another in our video series accompanying the good, the bad, and the uncanny, exploring the Older Testament at Westminster Presbyterian Church. He was so good we had him back for a second time. This is Dr. Joel Baden, who is professor of Hebrew Bible at Yale Divinity School and also former teacher and friend of Margaret Fox. So that's good to have. But seriously, last time we were with you, we walked through 1 Samuel and now we get 2 Samuel, which I think is fair to say is David's book. There are plenty of other characters and there's a lot going on, but almost every scene, I think, in some ways, either figures David or he has a direct role in what's going on. Is that fair? So,
oh yeah,
and what a mixed character. I mean, he's Richard Gere. Oh, just dated myself. It's an old film. He's
was that Officer and a Gentleman? Is that what that was?
Yeah, close. He's this king who apparently can do no wrong in some passages, and then you turn the page and he's doing a lot of wrong. And I mean, can you just talk a bit about David, the character, Joel? Like, what are we supposed to make of this guy who, on the one hand, I think this is right. He makes Israel as secure as it ever is in its entire history. Is that about right? At least as extensive. And so from a military political perspective, he's fantastic. But there's a lot going on. Even some of the stuff he's credited for strikes me as a little bit iffy, right? The Ark into Jerusalem. We can talk about all this stuff. But
oh yeah,
open up David for us. Let's put David on the couch.
Oh man. So one of the nice things about the Bible is it doesn't psychologize any of its characters. It's nice and not nice. I mean, but legitimately, right? Like we almost never get a sense of what anyone's thinking or feeling, or rarely even what they look like. Characterization is not something that the Hebrew Bible is particularly good at. But you're right. We know more about David, or we get a broader, deeper picture of David than we do of any other biblical character in the Hebrew Bible. By a long shot. I mean, the only thing that comes close is Moses, and Moses is almost personality free.
He gets aggravated a lot.
Right. I mean, he's whiny, and like is that a personality? Maybe. But David is an interesting figure because what we're given in the text and what we might suspect like actually is going on are not necessarily the same thing. So like we want to distinguish between like accomplishments, like actual things that happen. And so, you said military conquest seems to have been quite the military leader. Great. That's a good thing. Especially in that period when, going back to Saul and beyond, right? There was a sort of constant external military threats, and securing the borders would have been a big deal, and all good things there. David, I think, legitimately probably brought the Ark to Jerusalem, thereby making Jerusalem into right. Jerusalem wouldn't be what it is for us today if David hadn't done that. David conquers it, makes it his capital, and brings the Ark there, right? Thereby creating both the political and cultural and religious capital of the people, which Jerusalem remains, and this is why it's still what it is. Like that's a legitimate accomplishment from our perspective, surely. Then there's a whole bunch of other stuff that's like all the peripheral stuff that goes into David achieving and maintaining the authority and the power to have done any of that in the first place. And that's where stuff gets tricky, because though the biblical text goes to really enormous lengths, really it feels to me like enormous lengths to make sure that we know that David is always acting in the best possible way. I often find myself saying to the text, right, like the Bible doth protest too much, right? It's like very clear that the things that happen around David are not so good. Like lots of people die. His political enemies die. The people standing in his way to the throne die. Some of his friends die. Some of his children die. I mean, it's like There's a ton of individual death that surrounds David that almost all is to the benefit of him or Solomon politically. And the Bible tells us over and over again that David was not responsible for it. And so, whatever. I think our task as savvy readers of the text is to remember that every text is trying to convince us of something. It's trying to tell us a story that makes us think something. And if we think of the David story as like in 2 Samuel specifically, as the story that's trying to convince us that even though a bunch of really bad looking stuff happened, and David came out as beneficiary every single time, that David was really the good guy, right? The man after God's own heart, the good guy that we've always like wanted him to be. So it's about striking the balance between those two things, and we have to overcome our like long ingrained view of David as the ideal.
Yeah.
What about, say, the telling of the Bathsheba story? I mean, what about the places where the text doesn't do that, where it does show David failing in some way without, trying to exonerate him? Yeah.
So here's how complicated do you want me to get here? Really complicated? I'll get complicated. Let's get complicated.
Okay.
Here's the story. The David story is not one story. I think there's multiple tellings. You can see this sometimes. Like there's certain stories that repeat weirdly. I mean, we talked in the first Samuel a bit about like the David origin story being actually two. But if you remember in 2 Samuel, there's the moment where 2 Samuel, it's in 1 Samuel. The moment where David is like has the chance to kill Saul but doesn't.
Yeah.
Right. That happens twice, like 2 chapters apart, and it's the exact same story both times. And that's weird. Right?
Funny story too.
It's funny stories too, right? Like, but they both actually fit to the thing we're talking about here, which is Saul is coming after David, and we as like pro-David people are like, bad Saul, stop coming after David. And David has the chance to kill Saul, but doesn't, and says things out loud like, "Boy, Saul may die, but if he does, it's not going to be my fault." like, I have every right to kill you, but I won't.
Yeah.
You're trying to kill me for no reason. It's all very set up-y. But anyway,
that's a nice grocery store you got there. It'd be a shame if something happened to it, kind of thing, right?
I mean, and that's now you're telling the story of Abigail and Nabal, which is exactly that extortion. We're still back in 1 Samuel, but that's 1 Samuel 25, I think. But like that's exactly what happened there, right? David's like, "Boy, you sure got some nice sheep here. It'd be a shame if your shepherds were all killed and someone stole all your sheep." And then he died. There's lots of stuff like that.
Yeah.
But when you get really complicated, so there's multiple tellings of the David story, but there's also multiple layers of it. And I like just to in brief, right? From my perspective, the earliest layer of the David material is actually a very pro-David, defensive David, which falls under the literary genre of apology, which is to say the recognition that some stuff looks bad, but I'm going to explain to you why it's not, which is an ancient literary genre that we actually have examples of from thousands of years before David comes on the scene. But a lot of the text that goes to that. So every time you see something that's like, for example, when like the general from the north, Amasa, comes to like make peace with David, and the text tells us like 7 times in one chapter. But and when he left David's like throne room, he was perfectly safe, and he left David safely, and then he's like dead 2 seconds later, and like what can you say except obviously David didn't do it? Like those kinds of like apologetic moments are part of that first layer, like justifying David despite all the bad stuff that happened. And I think that's got to be an early layer of the text, because it has to be speaking to people who have some memory or notion of David as bad, right? And very brief side note: lots of people in Israel would have thought David was bad, right? He was this figure who took over tribes that had never been, a figure from the south who took over all the tribes in the north. And we have stories about the fighting that went on between them and the people from the north who wanted to secede. lots of people were unhappy with David. I'm sure there was plenty of anti-David sentiment in Israel. And this first layer seems to me to be an almost contemporary telling of David's story, acknowledging all the stuff that happened, but also explaining why it wasn't so bad.
Yeah.
And then there's, I think, a second layer that that includes the Bathsheba material, and I think all the material that involves the prophet Nathan, which is always tied to Bathsheba, right? So the prophet Nathan who comes along and is like, you shouldn't have slept with her, and so as a result, your first child is the child of that is gonna die, and there's gonna be another one, and who shows up again at the end of David's life with Bathsheba to promote Solomon. To me, this is a pro-Solomon layer that it needs to downgrade David in order to promote Solomon.
Mm-hmm.
Why is Bathsheba, the Bathsheba story is not good for David, but it's necessary for Solomon, right? It's Bathsheba is the mother of Solomon. How come she gets special? How come she becomes king when he's fourth in line? So we have the same kind of cycle occurs, and again, on a literary level, with texts sort of justifying Solomon, and Nathan and Bathsheba serve that purpose. So part of that has to do with the downgrading of David, where David's not perfect, but Solomon is the necessary next in line. And we'll get to it, I think, later in our conversation. A later layer of the David material is the one that belongs to, I think, the greater editorial project of the broader Deuteronomistic history that is Joshua through Kings, for which David has already achieved the status of the great first king to whom everyone should aspire. And that layer adds in these ultra positive aspects of David's life, really mostly on his deathbed at the beginning of Kings, that totally 360 our idea of who David is. You read the earlier material about David, and then you get to the Deuteronomistic assessment of him. You're like, wait, what? That's the guy we're talking about. But again, we'll talk about that as we talk about sort of the way the David picture shifts. But that's my quick, complicated answer to how come David looks great sometimes and terrible sometimes, and then differently great other places. It's because there's lots of people invested in telling David's story, but for different reasons.
Yeah. Should we move on to that third layer, just so we've got them all on the table here? So you've got the apologetic layer. David wasn't really as bad as you think, or you've got the anti-David layer, prop up Solomon, but then you've got how is David going to be memorialized, or what's his lasting importance? And where do we begin with that? Is that where chapter 7 comes in, or is it?
Yeah, so chapter 7 is probably part of that. It decidedly, I think, is part of that. Right. So again, we have to think for ourselves, when did these ideas about David emerge? Right. And we don't want to think about it from the sense of the text, but rather from the culture that's producing the text. Mm-hmm. My sense is David as the ultimate paradigm of the great king is something that is going to emerge in our texts only once it has emerged in the broader culture, and that can't have happened until quite some time later, post David. In fact, you'd think that the order of events is reversed from what we normally think, right? We have the covenant, one of your offspring will always be on the throne, and therefore one of his offspring is always on the throne. But my suspicion is it's the other way around, right? You had a lengthy line of kings who traced themselves back to David, at which point that became the divinely ordained norm, right? Kings started to say, right, and the people would start to say, oh, we always have a Davidic king on the throne. But why? Oh, well, because, God made a covenant with, well, it must be David, obviously. And so that gets put into the text. That's the broader historian's view also, right? Is that in Judah, there's always someone from David's line on the throne, and there always has to be. And my sense is even when probably they weren't, I don't think the Davidic line continued uninterrupted for 400 years. But I bet they all said that it did. You know what I mean? I think people probably said that they were Davidic one way or another in order
Sure.
to maintain, because it becomes a myth. We have lots of these. I mean, we have these kinds of myths today. The Kennedys, whatever, like the Bushes. Let's probably stop there. But there's like the idea that like a Davidic king should always be on the throne, I think, comes out of Davidic kings or people who identify themselves as such being on the throne.
Yeah.
So the idea of David as like paradigm becomes a part of like the legacy of Judah and of Israel writ large, right? These are kings who, by virtue of being in a genealogical line, are fulfilling a divine edict that goes all the way back. And the founding figure of all founding figures get idealized and glorified. We do it all the time, right? George Washington, I often use Thomas Jefferson as the example, because Jefferson is this wonderful, the great statesman who only in the last, I don't know, generation or two, maybe we have suddenly been like, wait a second, maybe that guy wasn't the greatest person of all time. So we gloss over if you read like the John Adams, Thomas Jefferson correspondence at the time, you'd be like, boy, that Jefferson was a real jerk. Both of them were, they were all kind of jerks, and that's like the contemporaneous record. And then if you read, the record of what Thomas Jefferson is like from an American, like a popular American history 200 something years later, these are like the greatest guys who ever walked the earth, right? Same idea. Yeah. Same basic idea, right? There's a desire, a cultural desire to like put founding figures on pedestals, and that involves reshaping and retelling narratives about them. So it's like we see it in 2 Samuel 7, we see it with the covenant, we see it in 1 Kings 1, right? David's deathbed, when suddenly this guy who has spent his whole life being a political military figure says things to Solomon like, remember to always walk in the ways of the Torah of Moses. And you're like, Torah of Moses? Like, that's literally the first time you have mentioned the Torah of Moses or any of its contents in your entire life. Like, legitimately, it is. But now suddenly he's, espousing like obedience to the Torah. Sure. And then like there are later versions of David's story. The Book of Chronicles retells the story altogether. None of the bad stuff is in there. Only good things. There's no difficulty. There's no Saul. There's no squabbling among Solomon's siblings. There's like none of the bad stuff. It's all terrific. He was fabulous and good. And you can watch the myth growing over time.
That's worth pointing out, especially because I think we're skipping Chronicles.
I'm shocked.
I know, the most important book.
Not because we're trying to protect David, but for other reasons.
For sure. Well. But I would say, like, for people who are interested in the way the David legend gets recast, read the David story here in Samuel, and then go read the David story in Chronicles, and look at what's not told in Chronicles.
Right.
And look at what is said in Chronicles that's not found in Samuel. Because David has gone, right? Chronicles comes from a period when there is no king, right? There's just a temple as the sort of political center of the Israelite people. And David, so like, what would it, a story about David inaugurating a kingship is maybe less, is more like mythological or like legendary than anything else. The Chronicles, when it tells the story of David, talks about how David founded the temple, not built it. Everyone knows Solomon did that. But like, this passing thing that happens in Samuel, or David's like, maybe I'll build you a temple. And God's like, no, your kid will do that. And he's like, okay. In Chronicles, the same thing. He's like, yeah, maybe I'll build a temple. And he's like, no, your kid will do that. But David then like designs the temple and hires its staff and like writes the liturgy. I'm not joking. Like, and like organizes the sacrifices. David makes the temple in all but like putting brick to mortar or stone to mortar. And like, so, you can get a real sense of like, if somebody back in the Second Temple period could retell the story of David, this is how they would tell it, right? And that's kind of the way we're always doing it. In our time and place, what's the way that we want to tell the story of David? What does that look like? what are we beholden to in terms of, and how do we approach the, maybe negative stuff? First Order of Chronicles is like, I don't need to approach it at all. It wasn't authoritative. It wasn't biblical, right? It was just a version. We're stuck with a bunch of conflicting and weird biblical stories of David.
Yeah, I wonder about that specifically as we're going through the Older Testament together in this course, because I think this may come as a surprise to some people who haven't really examined the David story closely. Because there's a very robust Sunday school David who, killed Goliath with a little slingshot, and wrote the Psalms, and is this real hero? I mean, the tradition has a way of sort
lies upon lies upon lies, Margaret.
That's right. Well, I'm just, I will say, like, this has always been a point where, you expect people to sort of tune out when you get to Leviticus, but I actually feel like this is one of the more challenging parts of the story, is sort of uncovering this sort of hero figure of David, who is not what everybody thinks he is. I'm kind of wondering, what you see. I mean, you teach at a divinity school, you teach at Yale Divinity School, people who are preparing for ministry, people who have kind of a theological attachment to these texts. I mean, how do you see your students kind of encountering and responding to these parts of the story?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think you're absolutely right. The most challenging parts of the Bible to read as a critical eye, and as a student or as somebody who's really interested in these kinds of questions, aren't the unfamiliar weird parts. They're the too familiar parts. It's like reading the two creation stories or the flood story and being like we are culturally are just accustomed to telling these stories a certain way, but that's not what the text says. And that actually presents far more of a challenge than, as you say, reading Chronicles, right? Or Leviticus, or the weird parts that we're like, somebody's got to read like Zephaniah today. Which a real book, by the way, Zephaniah. Did you know
that? We're not spending a session on that one, it turns out.
You're not. So, I mean, to that end, yeah, teaching the David material is wonderful in that, you do get like a big aha moment. Like, oh man, I've always thought of David this way, but even the text itself shows me something else. The nice thing about teaching at a place like Yale is that most of the people who have walked that door to sit in that classroom aren't coming in to have their priors affirmed. Do you know what I mean? They're not coming in and being like, I want to hear my Sunday school David. Now they might not know that they're coming in to hear something radically different, but they come in, I think, relatively open to that possibility. The other thing that I will say is, and for all I know, this is a generational thing, though it may be a recurring generational thing. My students, at least, are so hyper attuned in the best possible way, hyper attuned to issues of power, power and authority, that they are really quick to recognize in the David stories the way that text manipulates and props up power. The way that I certainly wasn't when I was a student. But they are suspicious. I think they're just suspicious readers innately, even of the Bible. I mean, they're like innately suspicious readers, and now they're going to turn that attention to the Bible. And I think it makes it doable for them in a way. They're able to interrogate these texts and recognize, they read the Bathsheba story, and almost every single one of them, regardless of background, are able to look at it and go and be like, oh, this is a story about sexual power, and really it's a story about rape, and identify that in ways that I think are of their moment, which is terrific and really, really good. The one brief story I'll tell is I was supposed to be this big chunk, right? The story, the lecture in my intro class where I do the David was essentially just like a mafia don, right? Which is like one of my favorite lectures to give. I show a clip from The Godfather. Like I mean, he fits every possible sort of stereotype here. I was scheduled to give that lecture in early to mid-November 2016. Literally the Wednesday after the presidential election. Wow. And I didn't. But I talked to my class for that class period about David. I didn't give the lecture, but I talked about David. But the political like parallels were so evident to everyone in the room. You know, both the idea of a political figure whose morality is questionable at best, and issues about the way that text, the press, media more generally present us narratives of political leaders. It was pretty easy for everyone in the room to myself included, to see why learning about a David, a historical idea of David, or even a literary presentation of David that is not the legendary perfected David of, you know, Judaism and Christianity, why that's actually an important thing to be doing.
Yeah. It's incredible to see things like this in and as scripture, you know, to encounter this here. Yeah. Matt, you're on mute. I don't know if there's a dog.
Sorry,
Matt's been asking questions the whole time.
Yeah,
oh shoot!
I had a helicopter circling overhead for some reason.
Oh, okay.
Anyway, that's a great answer and a great story to tell as well, because one of the things that we've been trying to talk about is what makes the Bible quote unquote authoritative. Is it because it somehow presents these, you know, what's the word I'm looking for? These, you know, these kind of these beautiful scenes we're supposed to emulate, or is there something about the way it reflects life back to us? And even in the composition process, we've talked about a little bit in these classes too, that these stories tell us maybe something about the nation around the year 1000. They also tell us a whole lot about the nation looking backwards at a later time, right? And trying to figure out, who are we? How did we get here? What are we going to gloss over? What are we going to whitewash in our history? And what are we going to remember for the sake of, you know, the trauma that endures and all of that. Yeah. Joel, this was great. We could go on for hours, I think, and still not kind of get to the bottom of this. I'm jealous Margaret got to sit in your classes. So
well, and Margaret can call me up anytime, you know.
Thank you. Appreciate it, Joel.
So can you, Matt.
Thank you. And thanks for your time. We do really appreciate it.
Wonderful.
Absolutely. My pleasure.